Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, What's Next? Approaching the Regulations Process Around 3D Printed Medical Devices, brought to you by Medical Design and Outsourcing Magazine and HP. Just a couple of housekeeping details before we get started. You will see several boxes on your desktop, all of which can be moved around to suit your preferences. You can enter your questions in the Q&A box, and they will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Another box to note is the Additional Resources box, where you can download the slide deck for today's presentation. Your speakers for today's webinar are Mike Drues, President of Vascular Sciences, and David Johnson, an Application Engineer at HP. I'm Danielle Kirsch, Senior Editor of Medical Design and Outsourcing and Mass Device, and I'll be your moderator. Without further ado, I will hand the presentation over to Mike and David.
All right, thank you, Danielle. So, as Danielle said, my name is David Johnson. I'm a Application Engineer for HP. This is a continuing webinar we're doing in the medical device space through HP. It's an area we're trying to grow and making sure our customers have the correct education as they're approaching that entire industry. So what we'll be going over today are the specific requirements regarding your medical application, the importance of product classification, and then approaching biocompatibility. So just to give a little background on myself and Michael Drues, I've been in 3D printing for about 5 years now. Background's in mechanical engineering. I was with a few small startups prior to coming to HP, and I've been here for about a year. The role I have right now is I live in Chicago, and I help customers in the Midwest area develop plans and strategies regarding 3D printing. And then I'm also in charge of helping develop the medical device area for HP and making sure that we're giving our customers the right resources and pathway to make this a successful industry for them. Michael, if you want to give your background as well.
Sure. Thank you, David. First of all, thank you to you and to HP for the opportunity to participate in today's discussion. In a nutshell, my background is in biomedical engineering. That's what my Ph.D. is in. I started out in this business about 30 years ago as an R&D engineer before transitioning to the dark side, in my case, not marketing, but regulatory. And now I work primarily as a regulatory consultant for a wide variety of medical device companies and other medical technology companies. I also work part-time as a consultant for the FDA as well as Health Canada. So I really see a lot of these issues from both sides. And specifically in the area of 3D printing, David, you mentioned, I think you've been working in this area for about 5 years. I've been working in 3D printing and related areas for more than 20 years, and not just 3D printing of medical devices, which I've been involved with several devices that are now on the market, but 3D printing of drugs and biologics and tissues as well. So I'm looking forward to today's discussion.
And one important note, because Mike, I think, is a very, very rare expertise, especially for this topic. I know you also do have some subject matter experts in the topics we're talking about. So really, Mike is a perfect fit to go over our agenda and all the topics that we're covering. So I'm very excited about the conversation coming up, and I hope our audience is as well. So the first area to start, just because this can be a very complicated topic that I know Mike can easily dig in very deep for the entire webinar. I do have a poll just to gauge our audience of what the background is. We have medical practitioners, so surgeons, clinicians, manufacturing, so R&D, quality, production, engineering background, designers, biomedical engineers, and also others, so owners, presidents, founders, regulatory aspects. If you can fill this out, this will give us a better idea of certain areas we should focus on a little bit more, just based on the spread of different understanding of this industry on the regulation side and 3D printing side. So I'll give a few more seconds for that. Still see a few coming in, so.
So David, what are the results?
We are just about over 60%. So let's see. Oh, interesting. Okay, this was a lot more manufacturing than I was expecting. So it looks like we're about 50% manufacturing background, about 14% design, and 20% biomedical engineer, 18% others. So yeah, so this will be very heavy manufacturing. So Mike might need to go a little more into some of the regulation side just to give a better foundation for our audience. And I think a good place to start is the quality systems. And Mike, I know you have a slide that I've seen in many of your webinars that goes into actually taking what's from the FDA and breaking down what they mean by the quality system. And it's something that, high level, you can go into the importance of it. And for the audience, this is every manufactured 3D printing production or in general production has to have some type of quality system for their manufacturing process. So Mike, if you want to go into some of the high level things to really keep in mind when it's a company's approaching this for medical devices.
Sure, happy to do so, David. So starting out at the beginning, so every medical device manufacturer, and one of the things we'll get into is if we 3D print a medical device, does that mean that we're a medical device manufacturer? But every medical device manufacturer has to be FDA registered. And part of the FDA registration process means you need to have a quality management system in place. You have to be following the quality system regulation, the QSR. And this particular quote on the slide, good regulations are neither specific nor rigid, nor should they be. This is me paraphrasing one of my favorite sections of FDA's website, what I call the preamble to the quality system regulation, where FDA basically explains their philosophy, their approach to, in this case, the quality regulation. And one of the things that they emphasize is that regulation is not specific because the medical device industry is very broad. On one hand, we have things like Band-Aids and wheelchairs and EKG monitors. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have things like totally implantable artificial hearts. So that regulation, not just the quality regulation, but indeed all regulation, is usually not very specific. It's very broad and it's very can be interpreted in many, many different ways. And it's up to the medical device manufacturer to understand and interpret that regulation based on their particular technology, the types of devices that they're making, and so on. So if you're relatively new to this area, one of the things that you have to understand is regulation, at least in my opinion, is not intended to be followed like a recipe. Step one, do this. Step two, do that. It should be thought of as guidance, if you will, as a starting point, not as a stopping point. Does that make sense, David, or should we go into that in a little bit more detail?
I think that makes sense. And one really important thing to note that I know you highlighted on one of your prior webinars is the responsibility of this system on the manufacturer of record. So, for example, we have a handful of service bureaus that do some of the contract manufacturing. And based on what you said, the responsibility still comes from the contract or the manufacturer on record, not necessarily the company that they may outsource it to. Is that correct?
That is correct. So the manufacturer of record, or what I like to say, the name of the company who's at the top of the label, they're the ones that are ultimately responsible. And when I say responsible here, David, I don't necessarily mean just in the regulatory or FDA sense of the word, but also in the product liability sense of the word. So whoever is at the top of the label, they are the ones that are ultimately responsible. They are the ones that need to answer to FDA. They are also the ones that, the product liability attorneys will be going after if there's a problem with the device later on. So whoever is the manufacturer of record, that's ultimately who's responsible. And one other thing that I would mention, which is also part of that preamble on FDA's website, is you can delegate the work. The manufacturer of record can delegate the work to a service bureau or anybody else, but you cannot delegate the responsibility. The responsibility begins and ends at the manufacturer of record.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind, because you really need to have a lot of good information around, if you do use a contract manufacturer, that one, they're following the correct process that you put together, but two, it's actually being enforced, because those things are, as you said, there's a very painful penalty if these don't go correctly, and some very high stakes as well.
There certainly can be.
So regarding, as 3D printing is starting to be more and more of a production option for medical device, is the FDA becoming more familiar with what can be expected there? Because I know it's still a very broad sense, but this is a brand new manufacturing process, at least on the production side. Do you think that they're learning more and more as we go, or are they kind of really keeping it up to the manufacturer on record to outline everything that needs to be done?
Well, first of all, David, we should never underestimate the mental horsepower of the FDA. The FDA has an awful lot of subject matter experts, some of them internal to the agency, some of them, like me, external to the agency. I'm a subject matter expert for FDA in a few different areas. So we should never underestimate them. Another thing to keep in mind, David, is we have to be a little careful that we don't overgeneralize when it comes to 3D printing. Because there are, when I look at this as a biomedical engineer, there are probably about 20 different technologies that all come underneath the general umbrella of 3D printing, or what some people refer to as additive manufacturing. So the simple answer to your question is, I think that FDA is pretty familiar with most of the standard or traditional or well-accepted methods of 3D printing. But if you're working in an area of 3D printing technology that is new, that is not established, and one of the cool things about my job is I do get to work with companies that are truly working on cutting-edge kinds of technologies, then FDA is probably not as familiar with those technologies. And part of the importance of managing the relationship between the company and the FDA is educating the FDA on whatever new technology that you're developing. So simply put, if you're doing 3D printing like your grandmother did it, so to speak, then I think it's safe to assume that FDA is probably familiar with it. But if you're doing it differently, or if you're using a different technology, then maybe not so much.
Okay, very good point. So we'll move on to our next slide. And Mike, what would be your kind of one sentence takeaway from everything we just talked about on this slide?
Well, at the end of the day, the manufacturer of record is ultimately responsible. They're responsible for understanding not just their medical device, but the process that they're using to make their medical device, whether it's a 3D printing process or something else. They're responsible for knowing, and then they're also responsible for helping the FDA to understand that device and that process as well.
All right, perfect. So keeping on the regulation side, we're going to go into product classifications. And this is a very important aspect to kind of navigating the medical device space. Mike, can you give a high-level kind of background for this pyramid? What can be expected from I know your claimed class 0 wellness device all the way to class 3, and kind of give an understanding of what steps are required, and also like how these classes change with the risk to the actual patient and product?
Yeah, great question, David, and at a very high level, because this is obviously something that we can go into in much, much more detail. But here in the United States, we use essentially a 3-tiered classification system. Now, this is different in other places in the world. Other places in the world, they'll also use a numerical classification system. But please don't assume that if your device, for example, is Class 2 in the U.S., that it's automatically going to be Class 2 in the EU or Canada or somewhere else. It's not necessarily the case. So what we're talking about here is only applicable to the United States. So we divide the medical device universe into different layers, different strata, as illustrated on the slide on the pyramid here. At the very bottom is what I call Class 0 devices. Now, FDA does not use this phrase, but I do. Class 0 devices. These are what we call wellness medical devices. These are devices, perhaps like the Fitbit is probably the best known example of a wellness device. These are not regulated by the FDA in any way, shape, or form. So if we had a legitimate wellness device ready to go today, we could start marketing it here in the United States this afternoon. That's not my advice, but we could do it. No FDA registration, no 510K, no de novo, no design controls, no quality management system, no nothing. One level above that are the Class 1 or sometimes the Class 2 exempt devices. And the word exempt in this context means it's still regulated as a medical device, but at a low level. In other words, there's no 510K or no de novo. You still have to have FDA registration. You still have to have, in most cases, a quality management system and design controls and so on, but no formal review of the device by the agency in the form of a 510K or a PMA. Moving up a level from that are the Class 1 or Class 2 non-exempt devices. So the word non-exempt in this context means that a formal review of the device is necessary. In other words, you would need, in this case, of 510K or de novo. And for those that are new to the industry, the main difference between the 510K and the de novo is that a 510K is for devices that are very similar or what we call substantially equivalent to another device already on the market, whereas a de novo is also for Class 2 or lower medical devices, but those would be for devices that are not similar or not substantially equivalent to another device on the market. And then finally, we get to the apex of this pyramid, the Class 3 devices. These are the most risky devices, typically life-supporting or life-sustaining devices, and a pre-market approval or a PMA or sometimes an HDE, a humanitarian device exemption, sort of the medical device equivalent to the orphan drug program. That would be what is required there. I think, David, the most important thing for people in this audience to understand when it comes to 3D printing is that the manufacturing process, in this case the 3D printing, bears no impact whatsoever on the classification of the device. In other words, the classification of the device is going to be contingent on many things, but the process that we use to make it, whether it's 3D printing or injection molding or something else, is not one of them. Does that make sense, David? I'm happy to go into it in a little bit more detail, but is that a good start?
Yeah, no, I think that's perfect. And I like to highlight the point because a lot of our customers come from injection molding processes, and they look at 3D printing. And to what you said, whether a part is injection molded or 3D printed, regulation side doesn't really care. It's the part, what it does, some of the quality systems towards it, but that specifically how it's made doesn't really affect it.
It does not affect it in the regulatory sense, David, but let's be a little bit careful that we don't overgeneralize on the quality sense. When it comes to the V&V, the verification and validation, for example, of your manufacturing methods. Look, one of the most basic tenets of the design controls is you have to validate your manufacturing method. I don't care what that manufacturing method is, whether it's 3D printing or injection molding or something else, you have to validate it. So the details of how you do that validation obviously are going to be a bit different, whether you are doing 3D printing or something else. But the overall principle is exactly the same. So other than that, David, I think that's the important point to remember here.
No, I think that's a very important point. And this is a question I've gotten before, so it's always good to have someone who knows the industry very well give a great answer to it. So I've had a customer that was in a Class 1, Class 2 exempt, had a part injection molded out of PA12, which is a material that HP supplies. And now they want to do the same exact product, but they want to 3D print it for production. What do they have to keep in mind regarding the regulation side? Do they need to change anything in order to keep things updated on the FDA side within that process, assuming that their product and the design still qualifies as a good, safe product for the application looking at.
Yeah, great question, David. And I think the important thing to point out in this particular scenario is you're asking about an exempt device. So the simple reality, and I know we're having this conversation in the context of a public webinar, but the simple reality is that exempt devices are not looked at nearly as rigorously by the FDA or, quite frankly, anybody else as non-exempt devices. That kind of means that the manufacturer has a little more latitude, a little more wiggle room to make changes, for example, without necessarily notifying the FDA. But with that latitude, with that wiggle room, comes the responsibility. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we are making medical products here. So even if you're working on a Class 1 exempt device and you have your previous manufacturing method is, for example, injection molding, and you're now switching to 3D printing, you still have an obligation, never mind as a regulatory or even a legal perspective, you have an ethical obligation working in this industry to make sure that the 3D printed version of your device is, quite frankly, just as good as the device that's coming off of your injection molder or whatever else. So that I would like to believe, David, maybe I'm a little naive, I would like to believe that everybody in this industry would understand and accept that. But unfortunately, I didn't fall off the turnip truck yesterday. Not everybody, does look at it that way.
Absolutely. And then as far as looking at this and, Class 1 through 3 all have some type of quality system they have to set up. Are there processes that they can follow based on what exists now for standards? There's a few standards in production that could qualify, or is it something that, the customer themselves, manufacturer record, would have to develop and say, here's what this process looks like in each of those scenarios? And do they technically change from Class 1, 2 to 3 based on the quality system, or would it be the same level throughout, regardless of the class they're at?
Great question. So they are not the same throughout. As a general rule, as the class of the device increases, the regulation becomes more specific. So, for example, Class 1 devices are only subject to what we call general controls. These are the most basic kind of controls. These apply to medical devices across the board. Whereas Class 2 devices, oftentimes we have to follow what are called special controls. And by the way, I hate the phrase special controls. It's not like everybody shows up, gets a trophy. There's nothing special about them. Instead, these controls, these standards, these regulations, whatever you want to call them, they become more specific. And that should make perfect sense to everybody, because as the class increases, the risk increases, the technology typically becomes more complicated, maybe your manufacturing method typically becomes more complicated. So the regulation doesn't become more special. That doesn't make any sense. Instead, it becomes more specific. And similarly, when we get up into the Class 3 universe, the regulation even becomes more specific. So the classification question in part will determine the level or the type of regulation that you need to follow. The other reason why this is important, David, is because you're asking about standards. There are some standards that apply across the board, like, for example, biocompatibility, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a few minutes. That applies to virtually all medical devices. It's certainly devices that are going to come in contact with a person. So maybe not a piece of software, for example, but virtually all medical devices. Whereas other regulation is much, much more specific. For example, in 3D printing, as maybe some of our audience knows, FDA put out a guidance specifically on 3D printing probably about 4 or so years ago now. I was one of many people that were involved in helping to put that together. But I'll be honest with you, David, that is a very, very general guidance. It's like most guidances are. So there's not a lot of specific information in there. It's kind of like what I said about the quality system regulation earlier. It's intended for a very, very broad audience. Ultimately, it's up to the manufacturer to understand the intent of that regulation and then to apply it to their particular situation. Does that make sense?
No, that makes perfect sense. And I got a note from Fernando, says that we had a few questions. Fernando, I know you said there was one or two that were pretty specific to this slide?
Yes, exactly. So, Mike and David, there are two questions that are kind of similar regarding the FDA approval process and also to the manufacturer, the point that we addressed on the previous slide. So one of the questions is regarding if from a medical device research company, they are not the manufacturer. So they're getting the device by a contract manufacturing. So who needs to have the the QS in place and have the 510K and have all the certifications? How does the medical device company and the manufacturer work together? Who needs to have the approvals?
Yeah, great question. So in a nutshell, usually the manufacturer of record, as I said earlier, the name of the company who's at the top of the label, they're the ones that are ultimately responsible. So they're the ones that would own the 510K. If it's a 510K device, they're the ones that would have a quality management system in place and so on. However, if they're farming out the work to a contract manufacturer, whether it's a 3D printer or somebody else, then usually the contract manufacturer will also have their own quality management system. They may or may not be FDA registered, but in that particular scenario, the quality management system of the manufacturer of record really is nothing more than sort of a pointer to the quality management system of the contract manufacturer. At the end of the day, as long as everybody is talking to one another, then I think the system will work. If people are not talking to one another, then problems start to happen.
Okay, good. Yeah, we had two questions on the same topic, so thanks for your clarification, Michael.
You're welcome.
All right, perfect. We'll move forward. We're a minute or two behind, so I'll go through our next slide a little quick. Mike, this was an example you gave that I completely changed how I was looked at the class 1, 2, and 3. And as the audience go through, just keep in mind, with the scalpel, based on your knowledge, kind of think about what classification level that this would put it on. And Mike, if you can go into what your claim is to the actual device product and how that can actually shift the requirements of the classification specifically for this example.
Yeah, great question, David. So a lot of people think that the class of a device is simply a function of the technology, what it does, how it works, and or the risk. And while the technology and the risk will influence the classification of a device, the other thing that's just as important, if not even more important, is what we say about the device. In other words, the labeling. Specifically, what I'm talking about is what I call the high-level labeling, the intended use and the indications for use. And the scalpel is a perfect example of that. Because if we label a scalpel for a general indication like cutting tissues, then that scalpel is what we call a class 1 device. However, if we have exactly the same scalpel, and when I say the same, I mean literally exactly the same shape, the same size, the same materials, and so on, but we label it instead of for general use of cutting tissues, if we label it specifically for ophthalmologic surgeries, in other words, eye surgeries, that scalpel now becomes a class 3. Now, it should not take an MD or a Ph.D. or an RAC after somebody's name to appreciate it. Gee, there's a pretty big difference between a class 1, probably a class 1 exempt device, which, as I said earlier, would require no formal review of the product by the agency, versus a class 3 would be a PMA. It's a pretty big difference just simply based on what you say about the device. But that actually happens fairly frequently. So classification is definitely a function of the technology and the risk, but it's also a function of the labeling. And simply put, you have to look at all 3 parts of that equation to ultimately determine what the classification of your device is.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important thing, because also with what you claim the product can do can also require a higher classification. So very important aspect as you're going through this process.
And David, just one other thing I would point out. I'm sorry, David, just one other thing I would point out very quickly. Classification is a function of the technology, the risk, and the labeling, but notice it's not a function of the method that we make it. And so whether you're making it as for a 3D by a 3D printer or something else, that's usually not a determination of your classification. So I guess the message here is don't just listen to what I'm saying, but also listen to what I'm not saying when it comes to the classification determination. Sorry, David, please continue.
No, absolutely. That was a very, very good point, especially as a lot of this approach is very similar to manufacturing that's being done today. So I did want to give a high-level discussion on biocompatibility. I know this will be difficult because, Mike, this is one of the expertises you have. If you can give a quick explanation of what biocompatibility is, why it's important for medical devices, and then we also have a table that will go on the next slide just to dig in a little bit deeper on.
Well, as you alluded to, David, I happen to be a subject matter expert for FDA in a few different areas, one of them being biocompatibility. So this is a topic that I do know something about. Simply put, here's my very, very simple definition of biocompatibility. You put a device that's made of some material in contact with a patient, and they don't drop dead. That's the simple definition of biocompatibility. Now, of course, there's infinite number of shades of gray that go into that. But biocompatibility is one of these sort of basic, I would like to say as a biomedical engineer, is a no-brainer, David, something that, we should all be aware of and concerned about when it comes to making medical devices. I don't care if we're 3D printing it or using, some other manufacturing method. Biocompatibility is biocompatibility. And if you want, David, I'd be happy to share very quickly sort of an anecdotal story to illustrate the importance of biocompatibility. Do you think that would help?
Yeah, sure, if you can keep it short as we go through it.
Sure, very quickly. So I had a new customer come to me a few years ago, and they were developing actually an implantable device, a device that was going inside somebody's body for the rest of their life. And I was going down the checklist of, have you done this testing? Have you done that testing? And then I got to the topic of biocompatibility, and I said, where are you on your biocomp testing? And they said to me, what's that? They did not know what biocompatibility was. You're laughing, David. You appreciate my not-so-sunny use of humor. I wish I can tell you I was making that story up. I am not. That is a true story. I would like to think that it would not take an MD or a Ph.D. or, in my case, a subject matter expert in biocompatibility to be able to ask the question, gee, you're putting this device inside somebody's body. It might be a good idea to ask the question, are they going to, is the patient going to react to it in some way? This, unfortunately, David, is exactly why we have thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of regulation, because while the vast majority of people working in this industry do know what they're doing, some people don't. And that's why we have so much regulation. And so I would like to think that biocompatibility is one of these no-brainer topics, but unfortunately it's not. So why don't we get a little more specific in terms of biocompatibility when it comes to 3D printing, David?
Absolutely. So this is what HP shares as what our biocompatibility tests are. The kind of standard is the ISO 10993. There's a handful of different test segments within that go through our processes. So within PA12, PA11, those are our most biocompatible materials. And Mike, it's sometimes a little challenging what this table really means as far as the requirements. So one really important thing is this is not a, submission of testing that you can go to the FDA. There's still requirements in the customer to do your own testing because these are specifically coming out of a 3D printer. They're not in the final shape of your design or if there's post-processing or anything like that. Can you go into the importance of, valuing this table, but also still making sure you're doing your due diligence for the regulation side for the FDA?
Yeah, happy to, David. So first of all, like I've said before, we have to be a little careful about overgeneralizing. And when it comes to biocompatibility, obviously, there's going to be different situations. So is your device going to be in contact with the patient's skin? That's one scenario. Is the device going to go inside somebody's body? That's another scenario. If it goes into the body, is it going to be just sort of a subcutaneous application? Is it going to be a blood contact application? Is it going to go into the body only for a short period of time, maybe a few minutes or a few hours? Is it going to be inside the patient for the rest of their life, which means years to decades? So we have to be very careful about overgeneralizing. The other thing that we have to be really, really careful about, especially when it comes to 3D printing, and I've seen people make this assumption, and I think you have as well, David, they'll assume that if they buy a biocompatible material from a supplier and they put it into their 3D printer, then what comes out of the 3D printer is still biocompatible. And that's absolutely not the case, at least not necessarily. And one of the most basic tenets of the design controls is it says you want to do your final V&V testing, your final verification and validation testing, including biocompatibility testing, on your final device. So don't just assume that if you buy a quote-unquote biocompatible material off the shelf, whatever that means, and then you put it through your 3D printing system, and the device coming out the other end, it's still biocompatible. Obviously, the 3D printing process, and as I talked about earlier, there's probably 20 different versions of this at least. But the 3D printing process is not very material friendly. In other words, typically you have high temperatures involved, you have high stresses and high shears involved. Those can cause all kinds of not just mechanical but chemical changes to your materials, and as a result, you can get changes in biocompatibility. And this is even a bigger challenge, David, not so much when you're talking about printing medical devices, which I suspect what most people in this audience are interested in, but ultimately when we talk about printing combination products or indeed living tissue, what some people call bioprinting, because putting living cells through this 3D printing process and having those cells survive, that's obviously not an easy thing to do. But that, David, would take us to a very different level of discussion. Maybe we could talk about that in a future webinar.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we got a handful of questions from this slide alone. So Fernando, would you want to go into what some of the questions we have?
Sure. So just real quick, 2 questions here. One, for a customer who produces parts with HP and JF materials, if they can utilize HP's biocompatibility testing, if they can use this table as a reference. And also the other question, I think that both questions, they are like really together. One is if they can use this table, and even with the HP testing data, if the FDA still requires the testing for the manufacturer. And this, Mike, it's something that you just discussed. It's not because we have this testing here for your final part, for your final product. You also need to have the FDA approval for that, right? So this table is more for a reference, more for a support, but that doesn't remove the obligation from the manufacturer for the tests. If you could just elaborate a little bit more, Mike, on that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to start. And then, David, I would welcome you, since this is an HP-specific question. Feel free to chime in with the company line, so to speak. But let me, in this case, put my FDA reviewer hat on for a moment, because as I mentioned at the beginning, I also work as a consultant for the agency. The manufacturer needs to answer a very, very simple question. Any reviewer with an IQ of more than 5 is going to ask this question. All right, you're starting out with this biocompatible material. You get it, it's one of these materials that's on the HP table that's in front of me. But now you're putting this through your 3D printing process. How do I know that the device coming out of the 3D printer, including the material, is still biocompatible or just as biocompatible as it was going in? If you can answer that question, I think you're in pretty good shape. If you're not sure, or if you can't answer that question, then you need to think about, how to best address it. So that's sort of the commonsensical perspective that I would begin with. David, what would you add to what I just said?
Yeah, so the test here is the actual testing is on actual parts coming out of the printer. But to your point, if you're outside of the, say, level of operating, so a certain packing density, if you go really high in that can change it. In addition, I would say very few of our customers are going to print something off the printer and then it's ready. You're going to have things that might improve surface finish, paints, vapor smoothing. All of those also affect the biocompatibility of the part. So if you print it and it's fine, and then it goes into a secondary that's not biocompatible, the part itself might be no longer biocompatible. So, it's a good reference to start with, but it's very important to make sure you're doing your due diligence that end of the day, the product that's shipping out will follow a lot of the regulations that are going through there.
I think that's a good response, David. And the only thing that I would add, or to reiterate what I said before, remember, one of the most basic tenets of the design controls is that you want to do your final V&V testing, including, in this case, the biocomp testing, on your final device. And to me, never mind as a regulatory consultant, but as a biomedical engineer, that makes perfect sense. Good regulation should always make sense. If it doesn't make sense, then it's not good regulation, and we should not have it. So I think that David's point is very well taken. This table should be viewed as a starting point, not necessarily a stopping point. And I think that's probably the gist of all of the fine print that you see on the bottom of that slide.
Yep, absolutely. I've gone through our legal team enough to know that's very accurate. Okay, so we do have a lot of questions. I want to making sure we're on schedule. So anyone that doesn't get a question answered either now or towards the end, we will follow up with an answer to you. So I want to make sure that none of those are getting lost. So one of the things I always like to do is actually showing real world cases. Hopefully that helps answer some of the questions that our audience will have. And the first one that I want to go over, this is a portable diagnostic device by a company called IUL. So it does a handful of different quantitative, qualitative aspects. So from the perspective of the classification, low level risk, probably class 1 exempt from the 510K. The importance of this is to the point of our biocompatibility table. These are really good surface finish with a prime and paint. So this is what a device looks like going out the door. As we talked about before, there's a lot of steps in between to make sure that the V application is correct on the biocompatibility side. So Mike, when we have a product like this, 3D printing is very good about making immediate feedback, whether to the design or a customer. So assuming that this device went through all the proper regulation for the design of the left, and they have a customer that say nothing really changes, they just want a bigger screen to print the same device for that customer. What does that look like as far as making sure everything's in check on the regulation side of that type of change to make sure that they're still compliant with this device?
Good question, and I have to give a disclaimer here. This is not a product that I was involved with. So in a very, very general sense, assuming that this is a class 1 exempt device, remember, as we talked about before, exempt means no 510K or de novo or PMA, in other words, no formal review of the device by the agency. Then, quite frankly, the company is really at liberty to make whatever changes they want to the device without necessarily notifying the FDA of those changes. However, as I said before, and I mean this very, very strongly, with that freedom comes the responsibility. I would like to think, as part of the company's quality management system, they would have a detailed change management procedure in place so that if they want to make the screen bigger, for example, or whatever change they want to make, they have the procedures to validate that change, to make sure that there's not a change in the usability of the device, to make sure that there's not a change in the mechanical properties of the device, the strength, for example. Maybe it might be susceptible to breakage more because it's bigger or something. I don't know. So all of that would ideally be falling under the company's quality management system, whether they're 3D printing this device or not.
Okay, that is a very good answer. And this is one of the questions I think I get the most. So having that clarification, I think, will definitely help our customers and audience. So moving on to the next one. And I really like this one because this shows the versatility of having 3D printing production capability. So this is a nasal swab that was produced for COVID. Zigzag, which is a service bureau, essentially converted all their production machines for HP to start producing this nasal swab. And Mike, they did ask for help from a consultant called Quality by Design. So the first question is, I know we've talked about the emergency use authorization, which might have fallen into some type of case like this. I'm not 100% sure with their regulations. This is a European company. Can you explain the emergency use authorization and then kind of how that entails with something like COVID and its ability to produce medical devices?
Yeah, great question. And again, separate from this particular product, because I was not involved with this product either, the emergency use authorization, or EUA, is a parallel way of getting a medical product, either a medical device or a vaccine or something, on the market specifically for a COVID indication. And one of the regulatory requirements, in fact, of an EUA is you have to make a COVID-specific claim. With, all of us know how much, COVID has impacted our lives, and it's been on the news, and I'm sure you've even heard people on the news, on the TV, talking about the emergency use authorization. So an EUA for a device like this would be an alternative to getting a 510K or a de novo or a PMA, something like that. But there's a couple of things that are important to understand about the EUA. First of all, these are all temporary authorizations. In other words, once the Secretary of Health and Human Services, HHS, declares this pandemic to be over, by the way, that's a political decision, all of these EUAs are going to time out. They're going to expire. So my advice to all of my EUA customers has always been, if you have a device on the market that's only on the market as an EUA, you better darn well start working on a 510K or a de novo or a PMA or whatever the suitable pathway is, so that once the pandemic is over and the EUA expires, you can keep your device on the market, assuming that that's the intent of the device. Another thing to keep in mind, and this is unfortunately something that you don't hear a lot of people talking about on the television, including the FDA people talking about on the television, is that the simple reality is that the EUA requirements, not just for medical devices, but for vaccines as well, the EUA requirements are in fact lower than they are for a traditional 510K or PMA, or on the drug or biologic side, an NDA or a BLA. And I'm not suggesting that that's a problem, but it is a reality. I mean, the justification is, these patients, they need something to help them during this emergency. But for people to imply, whether they're coming from the agency or elsewhere, for people to imply that a product that's on the market under EUA has undergone the same regulatory scrutiny as a non-EUA product, that's just simply a factually incorrect statement. So that's sort of a simple explanation of the EUA. And once again, David, I want to reiterate that, just like I've said before, the EUA is not determined by your manufacturing method. So if you're 3D printing a medical device or anything else, and this device is specifically for COVID, and you're planning on making a COVID indication, then obviously the EUA is a pathway that you should consider for getting your device onto the market.
All right, thank you. And I love this example because this is, I think, a product that, in the case of transitioning, I don't think could be done in a lot of other manufacturing methods. So this is why I really like going into it and just showing having production with 3D printing on hand allows you to make a transition like this. To move, as we're running short on time, this is a surgical guide by one of our customers called Mighty Oak. They have essentially they'll have a surgical guide, the model of the spine for spinal fusion surgery. They've gone through the multiple 510K processes, also have a ISO 13485 certification for medical devices. And this is a unique product because the other two we went over are roughly you're producing the same thing over and over, where this one is very patient specific, so it's going to be unique every time. How does that transition of being unique dependent on the patient shift within the regulation side?
Well, in my opinion, David, that's one of the most interesting and one of the most important topics to talk about in the context of 3D printing, because let's be honest, from an engineering perspective, using a 3D printer to print, 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 devices that are exactly the same. I mean, oh my God, can you think of anything more boring than that? That is clearly not the intent of this kind of technology. On the contrary, if I'm going to print, say, 1,000,000 different devices, or for that matter, 1,000,000 different pills. And by the way, FDA did approve the first 3D printed pill about almost 4 years ago now. In the interest of full disclosure, I was involved in the regulatory strategy for that one as well. So, we want to be able to print devices or pills that are a little bit different depending on the particular patient's anatomy, their physiology, and so on and so on. And that does present a number of very interesting regulatory challenges when you're printing different devices for every person. And I'll be honest with you, the industry as well as the FDA are still trying to figure out how to best control that. Right now, the vast majority of devices that are 3D printed that have gotten through the FDA, and there's a little north of 100 of medical devices now that are 3D printed that have gotten through the FDA. And in the interest of full disclosure, I've been involved in a number of them, certainly not all of them, but many of them. Most of them are pretty boring in the sense that they've taken that one-size-fits-all kind of approach. But I am working with companies, including some of the first companies, where we're trying to take that more personalized approach, and we're trying to come up with, for example, validation methods. Instead of validating the particular details of that device, you validate the process that we use to make the device. So again, that's a topic of a much different and a much more advanced conversation, David, but I think that's truly where this technology is going. Would you agree, or do you see it a different way?
No, I definitely agree. And I think with what capacity and capability that the MJF 3D printers have in the medical has been pretty phenomenal, just because, you're getting data from MRIs, some type of scan. You're able to, one, model the actual area of surgery, but also ways to improve it to make it more efficient. I think one of the users of this technology says it saves them about 90 minutes per surgery, which is a huge benefit to any surgeon, any process within that. So I do think that this is a key aspect to medical devices, and opening up the uniqueness to it will definitely be an advantage for the industry as a whole. So one thing we've talked about quality system. One thing we haven't brought up is the ISO 13485 certification. Can you give a high-level explanation of what that is and kind of its importance to medical devices?
Yeah, so simply put, ISO 13485, and by the way, there's a number of different versions of this. It's basically the quality management systems standard, the requirements for how medical devices are regulated. These apply to medical devices across the board, whether you're making a device via a 3D printer or something else. Now, this, as you mentioned earlier, David, this is a very, very broad standard. So you're probably not going to find much, if anything, in there specifically about 3D printed devices. It's up to the company to figure out, okay, the type of the device that they're printing and the manufacturing method that they're using, and then apply those standards, those general principles that go back to the what I call the preamble to the quality system regulation from FDA's website that we talked about at the beginning of the webinar. We need to figure out how to apply those standards here. At the end of the day, FDA views 3D printing nothing more than as another manufacturing method to make medical devices. And one thing that people need to understand about FDA regulation, David, is up until now, FDA regulates the medical devices directly They do not regulate the methods or the machines that we use to make them, at least directly. So in other words, let me use a non-3D printing example, a catheter. If you're manufacturing a catheter, you will need to get an FDA clearance, a 510K clearance on the catheter. You do not need to get, and it would be kind of silly to ask FDA for a 510K on the machine that you use to make the catheter. But this is another thing that's different about 3D printing compared to traditional medical device applications, and that is now some people are suggesting that maybe FDA should somehow approve the 3D printer that's used to make the medical device because, as I just mentioned earlier, all medical devices can be made differently. That's something that the industry as well as the FDA is wrestling with. I have a lot of opinions on that. I've made a lot of recommendations to FDA on how we should handle that, but that's not, as the lawyers would say, settled law, at least not yet. I don't know, David, if that answers your question. If you want to refocus the question, feel free.
No, I think it does. And I do want to, we have a few more questions, so we'll move on from here. For all those in attendance, I do want to just have a reminder to fill out your survey. We do have a few events coming up for the rest of the year, so answering that will allow us to focus on kind of the most needs within the upcoming content we have. And with that, Fernando, I think you said we had one or two more questions. Can you share those with us and we'll go through it?
Yeah, sure. So one of the questions is if a predictive device has been approved with the same 3D printed material, let's say PA12, nylon 12, for example, can we ask FDA to reduce testing since testing are expensive, and how HP can help with that? So again, it has already been approved using like other technology or other manufacturing method with the same 3D printed material. Is there a way to reduce some of the testing for the FDA?
Michael, do you want to
have any comments on that? Yes.
Yeah. At least from the HP side, it's not our area that we can really help out with because of what we talked about before with the, we're certifying our material is biocompatible within a range of printing. Taking a design or even anything approved complicates that as far as the manufacturer on record. And then, Mike, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would like to add something from the, from the non-HP perspective. Look, it's a very fundamental question, and I see this happen a lot, not just in 3D printing, but in other areas. Somebody will come to me and say, hey, I want to use polyurethane in my device. Polyurethane is used in this other device. So can I just say that, the other device is already in the market, therefore I don't have to do the biocom testing? Well, first of all, everybody has to understand that although time and money is important, not wanting to spend the time or the money to do any testing is not a good excuse for not doing testing. That's just not going to fly with the FDA, and quite frankly, it's not going to fly with me either. At the end of the day, what is incumbent on you to show is that your material is exactly the same as the other material. If you can show that your material is exactly the same as the other material, somehow without doing the biocom testing, then I think you're going to be in good shape. But remember the old Ronald Reagan mantra, trust but verify. If you come into the FDA and you say to the FDA that your material is the same, FDA's job is to say, prove it. I don't know, obviously, David, we're talking to an audience, probably all around the country and all around the world. So I don't know what the weather is where you are. But here in Southern California, it's almost always, the sun is shining and the sky is blue. If I walked into the FDA and said the sky is blue, FDA's job is to say, okay, prove it. That's the way this game is supposed to be played. So if you want to make the claim that my material is the same as the other guy's material, therefore I don't have to do the biocom testing, fine, no problem. You have to be able to prove it. That's what I would add to what you said about the HP.
Absolutely. And, as part of the HP team, we're here to support, so we can always answer questions. We do have a team on the regulation side that can help, but to Mike's point, you got to make sure you're following your due diligence as a manufacturer. We can assist, but we can't do everything within that realm. So unfortunately, we are.
And David, David, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
just one last thing real quick to add on that, just a little more pragmatic advice. I've been in a number of situations where once the company tries to figure out how to show their device is biocompatible without doing the biocompatibility testing, they come to the realization that it's probably faster and easier and cheaper just to do the biocomp testing and get it over with than to try to, make all these arguments as to why it's not necessary. So sometimes it's just, simpler and easier and cheaper to just do the testing and just kind of tick those boxes on the form as opposed to justify not doing it. That's another approach. But I think at the end of the day, that's the realization that a lot of folks come to, especially when it comes to biocomp testing.
All right, Mike. Well, thank you. A few minutes over, so I'll try to go through this quickly. We will have a follow-up email for attendees with resources that we talked. The questions that didn't get answered, we will follow up with those. I will personally look into them and making sure we're getting all of those answered. As I mentioned, this is one of many webinars we've done this year. So these two links will go to previous webinars we have done. They're all on demand. This one will be as well in the future. And then we also have trade shows coming up. If you're attending, please stop by our booth. We'll have more information as those get closer. And Mike, as a thank you, this was very valuable. And now that I learned a lot still, I feel every conversation with you, there's always a handful of notes. What is the best way for someone to reach out to you just to have any questions or see if they would be interested in using you as a consultant for their medical device?
Well, David, first and foremost, thank you for allowing me to share the stage with you. I enjoyed our conversation. I think we had a really good discussion. Thank you for everybody in the audience who watched, and especially to those who chimed in with questions. And obviously, thank you to HP for sponsoring this webinar. In terms of contacting me, I think David shared with you my contact information. Feel free to email me or call me. I'd be happy to help however I can.
All right. Sounds good. And Danielle, we will kick it off to you. I think have everything else on our side. So appreciate everyone that was able to join. We'll have some good follow-up to come in and after this.
Okay, thank you, everyone. If you haven't already, please take a moment to answer their survey question on your console that they had previously mentioned. Thank you to Mike and David for your time today. And thank you to HP for sponsoring today's webinar. This presentation will be emailed to everyone tomorrow, and thank you for attending.